Welcome to Lost Relation Chronicles.
My breath was ragged in my throat, pain laced across my back and neck, and I couldn't see straight. My vision swam as I fought for breath. I gulped in fresh air and lay there, so exhausted I couldn't move. There was nothing I could do, for a while at least. Maybe I could get strength enough to move. My thoughts wandered to her, and where this had all started, where everything had changed. She was fragile, tears made of dewed crystal, ready to fall at any moment. I couldn't touch her. He had done that. I didn't know if she wanted me to. I ached to touch her, to bury her tears in my shoulder and make her smile again. Her eyes were broken, shattered in pain and loss of innocence, a betrayal of trust one could never heal. I watched her shoulders shake with something I couldn't stop. Her grief, her sickened, betrayed soul. Mary sat in front of me, 15 years old. I was her best friend, her only true friend. Her others dumped her in an instant the second she needed them. Because she needed her privacy. I hated them for that. We sat by the river we'd both played in as children. Her tears didn't stop, and I couldn't halt them. There was pain and anger etched in the stone of my face. But when Mary looked up, I held only concern for her. For as long as we could remember, I was her knight in shining armor. When the boys picked on her, I'd make them stop. When she couldn't stand it at home anymore, I was always able to sway Mum to let it slide and provide a pillow. I was in love with her. Always had been. I felt wretched and wrenched between hatred, anger, anguish, and sorrow. My guts ached with clenching them in. Mary's head rose, and her reddened cheek shined in the waning sunlight. I looked away, and she stared at me. I felt my rage building, but buried it. I needed to be strong for Mare. It was like he didn't even consider it to be wrong. He's my father. For God's sake. He's not supposed to. I shushed her as her lips trembled, and I wanted to hit something. I reached out without thinking, and she flinched. I felt it like a knife slamming into my gut. I had frightened her. I shut my eyes and let my hands drop. There was silence for a moment, and I stood up. You can stay with us. It's settled. I opened my eyes, but Mary was still on the ground, her rich auburn hair shining like vibrant red gold in the last flickers of sunlight. The intense flicker of the sunlight off the dancing wavelets of the river shone in a brief sparkle of brilliance before they faded. As the darkness began to fall, Mary shivered. I shook my shoulders out of my jacket and draped it over her shoulders. Her cheek lowered and she sighed. She reached a hand up to let me help her up, and I pulled her up towards me. I could feel her hand trembling, and I let go as soon as she was on her feet. I felt the darkness building in me, and I smiled weakly at her. We walked slowly back up the trail towards my house. There was a slight, warm breeze, calming me with the scent of the sun-warmed river. I felt her pull away from me, an emaciated kid with bony, oversized hands and dark brown hair that kept falling across gray eyes almost constantly unless held under a cap. I terrified her, and her father had done it. He'd taken away even what comfort I could give her. I felt useless, completely without aid from my friend in her darkest moments. We walked without speaking or touching, feeling the evening lose its warmth as the fog and mist began to descend. Mum met us at the door, a warm smile and a hug for Mary. Mary broke down again and began to cry. I felt myself ache for her, and my face screwed up. I turned back without a word and left. I began to jog, moving down off the road and further away. I heard the thunder, but didn't pay any attention to it. The fog began to move away, and the stars blinked out as thunderheads rolled in like harbingers of doom. I was outside of Mary's place before I realized what I was doing. The rain began to come down, softly at first. I lifted my head up, feeling the cold drops cascade over me. Calmness began, finally, to seep inside me, as though the rain, drop by drop, was washing away my anger. I heard faint popping sounds, the metal rattle of tin cans being pelted with stones or something. There was a sudden curse, and then silence for a moment. I heard a familiar dry squeal of metal as the old, rusted hinges on Mary's screen door swung wide. I heard heavy footsteps and could almost see the steps of the one person in the world I actually hated. There was a grunt of surprise, like something a man says when he sees something he isn't expecting. Where's the witch? Little Witch always brings the pipsqueak as her bodyguard. There was a meaty heave and wheeze as Mary's father laughed at his own hilarity, and I opened my eyes. There was another grunt of surprise, like the kind an animal makes when its instinct warns of danger suddenly. I shook my head at him and felt my hands begin to shake. He shook his head. I don't even remember his face. I can never remember his face. I hit him. Once. As hard as I could. He fell back a few steps, clutching at his throat. I remember the rage on his face, the pure hatred, that I should so dare to strike him. There was a thick, greasy grin on his face as he coughed and reached around behind him. The gun was huge. I've no idea what sort it was, some sort of revolver with bullets the size of Ohio. I felt the bullet hit my shoulder, but I didn't feel anything else. There was no pain, no nothing. I looked down, at the blood beginning to stain my shirt. I looked back up in time to see the butt of the gun smash into my eye socket. Blindness followed, but still no pain. My hands moved forwards, fighting for a hold on the gun. I just watched, detached from it all, as I slammed my hand into his elbow, smashing it out of its socket. The gun dropped to the floor, and I blinked away the blood that was clouding me. Mary's father was on his knees, his face going blue as I choked him. My hand was wrapped around his throat, choking him as he gasped for breath. I heard sirens in the distance and someone screaming, a high pitch, like a small animal's. It was Mary's father, gibbering in fear as his pants soiled in his terror. I blinked as the blood came into my eyes again, and I felt my soul wrenching in two as Mary's pain tore into me. I heard something, a car door, or something, and felt my own hot tears on my cheek. Someone grabbed hold of my arm and tried to move it, but my arm wouldn't move. I turned my head and saw someone, a cop, shaking his head and talking strangely. He was speaking, but I couldn't understand his words. The cop was shaking his head and talking soothingly, and I smiled. I could still feel the tears on my face and blinked as the blood eased its pounding in my ears. I felt whatever was rushing through me slow and felt the rain as it hit my face, easing the raw redness of my eyes with cool drops. I swallowed as the officer gently pulled my hands behind me and felt Mary's father slide from my grip. My head, feeling like packed wool, tilted to the side. My voice sounded quiet to me, and I know I barely whispered. I also know he heard every word. Don't ever let me hear you've touched her again. I'll kill you. I'll just end you. Just like that. I barely remember the trial, or the conviction. 8 years. My actions and obvious lack of rational thought and reactions when the police arrived convinced the judge and jury that I was not myself at the time. And the fact that half the jury members, while overwhelmed by the evidence that I had committed the act, didn't know whether they would have done something different in my place. The first 6 months were hard. They were really hard. Mary's letters were the only things that I lived for. She was growing from an awkward young girl into a young woman, obviously pretending that everything was fine. Her letters lost their innocent sound, I guess echoing mine. The first time I was bashed was almost 2 days after I went in. A group of guys who liked to dominate other guys found out why I was there, and took it as an invitation to explain to me that there were those who lived by different rules. I tried to find that rage that Mary's father brought out in me, but it just wasn't there. Mary was safe. There was no need for it. The punches landed, but I felt nothing. I knew there was something wrong with me. I missed her. I had sacrificed everything for her. My freedom, my health. I hadn't even gotten a chance to see her. What I would have given to see her smile just once more. When I was in the infirmary, waiting to be treated, one of the old crims on janitor duty stopped by for a talk. He had heard about who and why, and wanted to meet the who. Murderer, battery, assault, armed robbery. Oh, and jaywalking. There was the list that Franklin Marsh had stacked up on the outside. 2 more accounts of assault inside, self-defense. Supposedly self-defense. He had a very philosophical view of life for a man serving a life sentence, and then some. His knuckles were scarred and swollen from arthritis and years of fights. He had the optional boxers and brawlers trademarks of the cauliflower ears and pug nose. But his eyes were clear, and his voice was calm. And he was the first person to actually tell me he thought I had done the right thing. Not much of a recommendation, I'll grant, but he was the man inside. He was the man inside. Once I got out of the infirmary, I met up with him in the yard. At 68, the man stood like a monolith in time, looking harder than most guys ever will. He smiled at me and I shook his hand. There was a murmur through the yard, and I wasn't touched from that day forwards. Frankie looked me up and down, and there came a small smile again. You ever box, kid? Ever work out? I shook my head, and he smiled that tiny little smile again. Over the next few months, well, years, I worked out. I built up some muscle. 2 years into my stretch, Frankie began to teach me economics. Where the hell he'd learned all that sort of stuff, I'll never know. I discovered a talent for writing, and began to write a very low-key story about characters that change and discover things about themselves they never knew. I didn't mention prison. I wasn't in there for a stretch long enough to know about it. When I'd spent half my life at age 70, then I'd maybe write something about prison. But change was something everyone goes through. I just put it into characters instead of myself. I also found something strange that I never knew. In wood shop, I learnt the turning and curve of wood, its simple molding into something beautiful to the eye, as opposed to the soul. You look at a tree and see the beauty of its creation and try to recapture that. Sales for my wood sculpting helped to keep my head above total despair when Mary's letters stopped. Not that she sent me money. She made me feel as though I could do something with myself. When her letters stopped, the only thing that made me feel as though I was worth something was the rich community clamoring for my artwork. Frankie didn't say much, but I knew he had asked a couple of his friends to keep an eye on me. But I wasn't going to kill myself. I had to get out. Fastest and easiest way to do that was to behave myself, keep my head down. I kept going with my sculpting, and on my 22nd birthday, I gave Frankie a present. It was a small wooden wren, a sculpting of the kind that always took his attention from whatever he was doing. Freebirds, he called them. Frankie stared at it for a long time and put his weathered old hand over mine. Thank you, son. Thank you. That was the last time I ever saw Frankie. Thinking he was over the hill and no longer worthy of the respect he damned well deserved. The guys who once thought me a plaything punching bag rounded him up in the laundry room. Frankie killed 6 of them before copping a shiv through the back, down into a lung. He seriously injured the guy who did it, Mitchell Roberts, leader of the so-called Bad Boys. Mr. Originality, that's for sure. When Mitch got better, the whole yard knew I was walking around with a target on my back. They tried to corral me in a secluded little spot in the west quarter of the yard, too close for the tower guards to see, and the others all had their attention focused more on the center of the yard. I was ready. Mitch threw the first punch, and I caught it in my open hand. There was something intensely gratifying when it stopped his momentum cold. My muscles held, and I began to squeeze. Mitch stared in horror as the sound of his bones breaking brought attention towards us. I let go and he slumped down, holding his hand in pain. I didn't smile. I never smiled anymore. The others began to circle, and I moved around, keeping them in my sight. One tried a lunge, but met my elbow. He went down. 5 left. I felt something slam into my back, and broad arms clasped in front of me around my ribs and began to squeeze as I was lifted off the ground. I reached back over my head, kicking out wildly. I felt my foot connect with something as I fell backwards, wrenching my hands down across my shoulder and jarring someone's chin. The arms let go and I rolled off, throwing dirt into the man's face. There was a heavy moan as someone hit the dirt, and I had time to see Mitch, his eyes wide with pain and sensation as his one good hand cupped his kicked balls. A fist smashed into the back of my head, and I lashed a leg out as I fell, taking someone off their feet. Blood flowed freely when he hit the dirt. He didn't move, and I watched the 3 remaining. Mitch was laying on the ground, gasping like a wounded goldfish, and was no threat. A kick punched out from my right, and I snagged it in my left hand, bringing my elbow down across the side of the guy's knee, dropping him down. I straightened as I watched the 2 still standing. I was settling into a rhythm, and they knew it. They backed down and ran. As whistles began to sound, the guards began to move around us, and I held my hands onto the back of my head, and he smiled at me, laughing under his breath. I was back in my cell before I knew it. There was a piece of paper on my bed. Open mail. I rushed to it, ripped the envelope apart in my haste, then saw the official print and knew it wasn't what I hoped for. At least not what I expected. I was to appear before the parole board for early release. Good behavior. There was a sound at my cell door, and I turned and stood straight as the warden stepped up to the open door. There were several guards at the bars, waiting for me to grow tired of living. Well, Alec, your day has come at long last. I thought we could have a little talk before you left. I nodded and sat down. If you want, sir. Have I done something wrong? Warden Jeremy Jones was a little older than me, at 46. He had 3 kids, 2 daughters and a son. His wife was a former customs officer who now ran one of the largest industrial chemical production factories in the country. We had barely spoken to one another in my tenure, other than his murmured condolences after Frankie had died when he stopped in the hall I was cleaning. If you'd done something wrong, son, you wouldn't be up for parole, now would you? I wanted to talk to you about something else. 2 something elses, actually. I nodded and the warden began to move around my cell. It didn't take him long. You've barely made a ripple since you came here with us. That's good. The kind of personage we need to see more of. Rationality-wise, of course. Technically, I'm sure we could all say we'd rather be out of our jobs. But that's really ideological bullshit. Now, son, you could have killed those idiots very easily. I've seen you training down there with Frankie, God rest his soul, and you have become dangerous. This is what troubles me. You've turned into a fighter in here, Kane." He frowned. "Alec, look. Outside, you were Alec Kane, barely out of school runt with a protective streak who snapped. Inside, you've really grown, but you've more of a chance to do something now. You're educated, thanks to our schooling. You're dangerous, thanks to Frankie's. And you're violent, thanks to the other incarcerates. What will you be outside? You can speak freely now, Alec. Just tell me." I thought about it for a while, then cleared my throat. "I've learned a lot here, sir, that's true," I answered slowly. "But the main thing I'll take with me is something Frankie taught me, that just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And it's the deciding of that choice that makes free men into jailed wrecks. I could have killed them, you're right. But Frankie knew the difference, and despite the fact they may have deserved it, and may even try again on someone else or me if I don't get paroled, well, despite all that, Frankie knew the difference. And so do I." Warden Jones held out his hand, and in it was a letter, an unopened letter. Mary's handwriting was on the front. I looked at him, and knew he had broken a strict rule for me, and I lowered my head to him in thanks. I took the letter slowly, and held it for a moment. It smelt of her, that scent I'd known so long ago, and I felt my eyes grow hot and prickly. Warden Jones smiled a small smile, almost Frankie's smile, and I sat down and heard the door shut behind me. I opened her letter with trembling fingers and took a deep breath. It was handwritten, and her flowing writing told me everything and nothing I wanted to hear. "I don't know if you're alive or dead. You never wrote to me, not once, and I still don't know why. I don't know if you read these. You went to hell for me, and all I've ever done is write you letters for it. I miss you, and us. I know you've only ever wanted to protect me, and that by not writing back, you might think you're protecting me from hearing about the horrors of prison or something. You probably don't know that you're putting me through horrors out here, too. I don't know if you're reading this, or if it's sitting in the bin, or if you're just a name in a book that they see and throw the mail away. I miss my friends so much. I was stumbling through the dark, and there you were, my shining light. I loved you so much then, Alec. I wanted you to hold me and kiss me and tell me everything was going to be okay. And now, I can't do it for you. I guess I wish we'd had more time, and that you should know everything. My father is dead. He had a massive heart attack last year after Mum left him. She left him after she found out what he'd done to me and what he'd done to you. He drank himself to death, and I went to his funeral. I miss the man he could have, should have been. I'm not even angry anymore. I'll never forgive him, but it doesn't matter so much anymore. He made me strong enough to hate him after he took you away from me. No, that's wrong. You made me strong. I've been waiting for you for all these years, and you haven't come back to me. I got a new joy, working in a nightclub in the city, called Night. I've got a bar apprenticeship going there with the lady in charge, Lauren. She's really nice, and her brother's nice too. He's in charge of the security staff. He left to go overseas a little while ago, and now that he's back, he's looking to hire some new people. There's another guy here that's asked me out, and I'm gonna say yes. You made me strong. You made me cry. You made me everything I am, and now you're not here. Or I'm not important to you anymore. It's okay. People change, and God knows you're in a place I could never be strong enough for. I loved you so much, Alec. I just want you to be happy. Okay, and if you do read this, then please believe me, I'm going to be okay. Thanks to you. Always your friend, Mary. My breath was ragged in my throat. Pain laced across my back and neck, and I couldn't see straight. My vision swam as I fought for breath. I gulped in fresh air and stood there, so exhausted I couldn't move. There was nothing I could do, for a while at least. Maybe I could get strength enough to move. Mr. Kane? I looked up and stared at the 3 men and 3 women who sat at a long table in front of me. Would you tell us, please, why we should allow your release from this institution? I swallowed the lump in my throat and breathed in shallowly. What would my qualifications need to be? The young woman sat back in her chair and tapped her pen on her notebook. Well, you would need to show remorse and be conscious of the fact that this behavior isn't regarded as acceptable in modern society. This is not the Stone Age, Mr. Kane. I took a deep breath, and the ache in my chest slowed to the back of my mind. The rationale behind assaulting someone like that is simple, miss. He abused his daughter, my best friend. I didn't go there to do anything. I'd been there so many times, it was automatic. I hated him, and he'd hit her and abused her. I couldn't even comfort her, so I lowered myself to his level. He's dead now. His own fate caught up with him. Do I regret choking him until he nearly died? No. I wish instead that he could have been the father to his daughter than he should have been, the husband to his wife. The woman pursed her lips and leant forwards to mark something in her book. but stopped. You show little remorse. I didn't say anything for a moment, but stared out at the window, where a tiny bird sat. A free bird. My hatred of him made me into something I never will be again, miss. I regret not what I did, but what it made of me. Something I will never be made of again. The old man on the end of the table grunted. What guarantees does this board have that you will not commit such a crime again? Attempt murder is a dangerous line to cross with no remorse, Mr. Kane. I nodded and felt the ache drain away. Yes, sir. But I did that for the love of my best friend. I no longer have that best friend, or her father to hate, and I'll never have that love. It's a new time for me. We all die young, in one way or another. That's why life is a second chance. Warden Jones shook my hand and smiled at me as the gate opened. I walked past him onto the steps of the waiting bus. I sat down and stared ahead at the open road, and at the small bird perched on the front of the car, and thought a lot about where I was going. First stop was my parents' place, to see my mom and dad. From there, I didn't know. I thought about the crumpled piece of paper in my pocket, Mary's letter. The miles moved past me unnoticed as my thoughts rounded to nowhere. After a time, I came to an old bus stop, and my finger pressed into the buzzer, and the bus pulled over. I stepped onto concrete my feet had not touched in nearly a decade. I walked for an hour, along the river where I had first kissed Mary behind the trees when I was 9, past the pool where she had kissed me back. I knelt down beside the huge rock where we used to lay in the sunshine and talk, and try not to think about one another. So close, so achingly close. Under the bridge I walked, until I found the spot where we used to hide things for one another to find. Under the loose stones and the old legs of the bridge. I bent low, and still managed to bump my head. My shoes in my hand. I sat down and moved my fingertips across the surface of the rock. I heard the faint sound of laughter, and looked down the river to where children were splashing one another with utter sinful joy, still in their school clothes. Something twisted inside of me, and I began to cry. For Mary, for myself, for the lost years, for the lost time. I pulled Mary's letter out of my pocket and read it again. It hurt less the second time, but not by much. As I sat there, I realized that I had held on to Mary far tighter than she had held on to me. She was in the outside world, which changed day by day, and moved on. Prison is routine and more routine. The same every day, with only new faces and stories to change it. I lifted the rock up, and there lay a small box, a jewelry box for a necklace or something. I opened it and found a jewel pendant, with a silver, jade, and ebony bear paw print in the center. It was linked to an American Indian-style necklace. It loosely fitted, sitting in the hollow of my throat and sitting no lower. I stood up, again forgetting that I was taller than when I was 9, and hit my head on the bridge above. I waded across the river and moved up the grassy hill to the side road my parents lived on. I knocked on the door, and after a moment, my father opened it. His old eyes, hidden behind glasses now, opened wide, and he gave a laughing shout, and his arms were around my shoulders, and tears were in his eyes. I hugged him back, and I heard a startled cry from the hall, and Mum was there too, all three of us standing in the doorway. There was a questioning voice, and someone came around the corner, and I saw her. Mary. But not Mary. Something different. Someone else. I frowned, and she laughed and came forwards to hug me as well. She was young, only 11 or so. A tiny promise of naughty in her eyes, and Mary's hair. Her mother's. Jesus. Nicole? Her wide jade eyes laughed at me, and she gave me a dazzling smile. Last time I saw you, you were barely, what, 4? Mary's baby sister nodded, and squeezed my waist in her little arms. Yeah, that'd be about then. It's been a while. Mum's out of town, so I'm staying with Mr. and Mrs. Kane while she's away. You've been working out, huh? All I remember of you is that picture up on the wall. I looked at the memory and almost smiled, but not quite. There was a hint of the person I was now, in the face and stance. But there was muscle where once there was nothing, and the eyes were different. So where's Mary? Nicole shrugged. She's moved into the city these days. She works at a club called The Night. She's one of the top bar girls there. She can do the whole Coyote Ugly spinning thing and everything. All the guys go after her, but she's still technically single. There was something in her voice, a hope almost. I hugged her and looked at Mum, who smiled sadly at me. Dad cleared his throat and held up a set of keys. I can book you in at work tomorrow. You can get yourself a license. You could ride before you could walk, so doing it legally shouldn't be a hassle. Want to see if you can still steer the thing? I held out my hands and Dad dropped the keys into my palm. I smiled then, feeling like I was home for the first time. I hadn't ridden in 7 years now, but when I slid the bolt back from the garage door and saw the little bike. I felt my eyes grow hot again. I touched the handle, and Dad cleared his throat from the doorway. We've given that one to Nicole. She rides almost as good as you did at her age. I bought you something, thinking you'd get out one day and need it. He threw the covers back off of another bike, and the tears flowed. Slashes of black, silver, and blue covered the outer casing. Chrome covered the rest. It was beautiful, sleek, fast, and with a small silver dragon on the fuel casing. Ducati. You can go for a run if you like. I shook my head and folded my hand over the keys. No thanks, Dad. Maybe later. Right now, I just want to spend some time here. He nodded and stepped back out of the garage. I followed, and we shut the gate slowly. He put his hand on my shoulder and squeezed gently. It's damn good to have you back, boy. Let's go have some dinner, huh? 3 days later, I was speeding down the highway with fresh clothing and a license. The city beckoned me, and I was coming. There was more traffic on the road than there used to be, but for all the changes, there was little difference, or at least it seemed that way to me. Some of the buildings looked newer, and others didn't. The roads looked the same, although dotted here and there with some travesty that could have been modern art. Night fell, and I was still traveling. The bike was amazing, smooth and powerful. It wanted to take me anywhere, but I just wanted to get to Mary. Soon enough, I was in the inner suburbs and came across some familiar streets. The night was built on the bones of a pool hall my father had once frequented, and I stared up at the huge building which pulsed with a heartbeat of party music. There were hundreds of people there, and maybe even thousands, all clamoring to get in. I'd never seen anything like it. I stepped up to the entrance and looked around, a little stunned at the enormity of the place, and the fact that there were so many people, all trying to get in. There was a huge, tall guy on the front door who was scanning the crowd with a professional eye, not budging an inch for all the screams, money, or promises that were waved in his face. He caught my eye and jerked his head forward. I frowned and turned, thinking he'd meant someone else. I'm Jason Trojas. What can I do for you? I didn't say anything until I turned back and saw him staring at me. I opened my mouth, then leaned it closer. I hear they're looking for some more workers. Security guys, whatever, you know? He nodded. I am. You a skin? I nodded once, and he looked at his watch. You want to talk business? Come back around 2 or 3? It slows down a little after then, when the shift changes. We get more people on. It's a little easier to handle. See you then. I blinked, then nodded. I turned to go, and he grabbed my shoulder. Look, if you want to go in, have a look around, you're welcome. It's a private party upstairs, so if you want, get one of the girls in the bar to fix you a drink. It shouldn't be too busy. I swallowed and nodded, and his eyes narrowed. I pushed past him and made my way through. There was an upstairs area that was completely packed, and a band played downstairs. I made my way over to the bar and sat down. I looked around, but couldn't see anyone. The club was quiet on the floor, with only a few people in. The larger room upstairs seemed to be completely packed, and I rubbed my chin as I considered it. It seemed like a nice place, and even if she wasn't here anymore, I did need a job. I had the control, the ice temperament, and the skills to back up whatever happened. I'd never been any type of security guard, but then, this wasn't exactly security guard type work. I leant back against the bar and a voice broke through my train of thought. What can I get you, hon? I turned to the voice and faced an incredibly beautiful woman of medium height with platinum blonde hair. Her eyes were a freakish blend of swirling orange and green, until I realized that they were contacts. I looked past her at the fridge and spotted some bottled water. I spread my hands and said that would be fine. She nodded and opened up the fridge. There was a sound of clicking heels, and the woman turned her head as she opened the till. I handed her my money and took the top off. The water was cool and reminded me of the creek Mary and I used to play in. I stared down at the bottle in my hands and realized that the woman who had served me was talking to someone at the other end of the bar. I stared at my hands, letting my hearing pick up anything in the room. I didn't even know why I was there. What was I expecting? To get out, grab a job, earn $1 million, and get the girl of my dreams. Her last letter stated pretty emphatically that she wasn't interested. I don't know how I'm gonna last down here for another 30 minutes, Lauren, I swear. These guys upstairs just stop drinking long enough to try and shag anything moving past, and then they go right back to it. If only they'd be a bit more charming then. Hey love, your hair matched downstairs too. Then I might consider actually being nice to them. Lauren laughed. Then go. It's nothing we can't handle. I appreciate the fact you came in on your day off. Come on, Mary. Why don't you knock off? She sighed. God, I miss. I knew it was her. I knew her voice. I'd known her voice for as long as she'd used it. I put the bottle down and stood up. I didn't want to turn, but I knew I should. My eyes slid into hers, and my breath stopped. I knew I was crying, and I didn't care. My breath was ragged, and I tried to speak, but couldn't. The tray she was carrying hit the floor with a smash, and the glasses scattered everywhere. The smashing glass broke the spell, and she ran. I called out to her, and started to run. We collided against the back door, and burst out into the cool night. I reached out and grabbed her hand, and she whirled around and slapped me. "You scumsucker. You're alive." I massaged my jaw and didn't say anything. Mary's breath was steaming the night air. Her awkward curves were gone, slimmed away in pure woman. She had low-cut black pants on and a white top. Her hair was caught up behind the nape of her neck in a gentle twisting ponytail, and her eyes were teared up. I stood back and stared at her. "You were all I had. I had nothing but you and your letters. You were right. I was so scared if I told you how things were without you, that you'd run a mile and never come back. I thought you were safe from your father. You had the world and you were moving and changing, and all I had was you, and nothing else. Of course I'd come to find you." Her breath was coming fast, and her face was screwed up in anger, or something very much like it. Hurt. She was hurt. Because I was there. I straightened. I shouldn't have. I thought, "You've moved on. That's fine. I understand that." I thought. I didn't think. "I've hurt you." She stepped closer to me and put her hands on my chest. My heart was racing, and I held my hands over hers. She leant in and put her forehead on my chest. "What do you want?" I didn't know what to say, and yet I did. I always had. "I want to be your one. When you feel all alone, and there's no one, I want to be. When the walls are closing in, I want to stop them. When the dark is there again, and you can't take any more. I want to be the one you. I want you. I always have. I always will. I want you." She stared at me, and I stopped talking. I knew then. It had been a mistake to come. A mistake to... Mary slammed into me, her hands going around my neck and her lips pressing against mine. Her hands were on the back of my head, and then we were kissing, and it was all there was in the world. I wanted to talk, to let her know how much she meant to me, to do anything, to just kiss her. My hands snaked around her waist and lifted her against me. There wasn't anything else in the world except for the feeling of the two of us together, and feeling that was enough. There was an embarrassed cough, and we parted for a moment. Jason and Lauren stood at the doorway, with Jason looking up and Lauren looking on approvingly. "So I guess you're all right then. See you on Thursday, kid." Mary laughed and kissed me again, and I heard the door close. Somehow we got back to her place, and Mary's hands ripped at my shirt. I had her top off in seconds, and we stumbled into her lounge room. The lights were off, but a fish tank in the corner provided a pale blue light to see by. Mary's shirt was over her head before we hit the floor, and mine was a button-less shredded mess in seconds. Mary moved against me like a drowning woman, clinging to me in powerful need, and I clung to her too. She reared back in surprise when she brought me out of my boxers. I was strong and hard and scared. She was kissing me lightly, moving against me, and I began to stammer. I've never. Mary stopped for a moment. "I know. SSH. It's okay. I waited for you, too." I frowned, and she colored. I brought her up into the circle of my arms and kissed her again. She rolled over, still kissing me with tender, light kisses. Shyly, she pulled me against her. I murmured my love into her ear. We had tender sex once we were done. I lay like that, perfectly happy. I opened my mouth as she took a deep breath. "I love you." We both said it at once, and then there was silence again. Mary's hands were on my shoulders, and her head lay on my chest. I could smell her chestnut hair, and felt my eyelids drooping closed. Our even breathing soothed one another, and we fell asleep like that. The next morning, the sun woke me as it spilled into the room. Mary stretched languidly, a naughty smile on her face as she surveyed the room and her path of destruction through my clothes. I gave a low laugh, and she held out her arms. I picked her up and pressed her close to my body, kissing her as hard as I could. "When did you get those?" I looked down and she was pointing to my abs, and I smiled again. I thought I should give me something to do inside. It was either this or cross-stitch. I'm not good with needles, so... Mary threw my shirt around her shoulders and tied the ends together across her stomach. She was wearing my boxers, so at least she was mildly covered. Problem is, there was something unbelievable sexy about her dressed in my clothes, and my stomach growled. Mary quirked her naughty smile at me and made her way into the kitchen. She poured 2 glasses of orange juice for us and handed me one. A phone began to ring, and Mary laughed as she looked around at the shambles we'd left her living room in, and I looked, too. The phone continued to ring, and I reached down and pulled it from out under the table and handed it to her. She smiled at me ruefully and flipped it open. "Hey, it's Mare. What's up?" She listened for a moment, then smiled. "Hey, kiddo. Yeah, he's here. I'll put him on." She held out the phone, and I took it slowly. "Hey." Nicole's voice shouted down the phone. "There were 2 guys here looking for you. Lawyers. They say you have to ring them and talk to them to set up a meeting. There's some Franklin Roosevelt somebody or something that made you their will receiver." I frowned for a moment. "You mean the executor?" There was a rustle of paper, and Nicole hummed to herself for a moment, a habit Mary had when we were children, whenever she was thinking about something. "No, I'm pretty sure they said that's what they were there for. You get everything he owns." "Is that the executor?" I shook my head. "Crazy old scumsucker." "No, kid, but it's okay. I'll call by later. I gotta go shopping first." Mary covered her mouth and giggled. Nicole cleared her throat and sighed. "Okay, sure. Well, they're here now. So do I tell them to come back at lunchtime or something?" "They're standing out on the porch." I laughed and told her that would be fine. After I hung up the phone, I shook my head and stared at Mary. An old friend I met inside made me the executor of his will. He'd been in prison nearly 60 damn years. What's he got left to have a will for? Mary shook her head and shrugged. "Why don't we talk about it over lunch? I'm taking you shopping." I smiled at her. "Sure, but first, why don't we have some breakfast? I'm hungry." Mary licked her lips and dropped her glasses on the table as she moved around into my arms. At last, I was truly home. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.